One of the biggest challenges that's standing in the way of greener energy is finding ways to store that energy. This is particularly true for electric vehicles, as well as other sectors. The solution is the development of batteries with greater storage capacity. The challenge is creating these batteries in a way that is sustainable and affordable. While we know that there have been huge advancements in EVs, how far have we come in developing those all-important batteries? I'm Jane Singer, and thank you for joining me today. It's wonderful to have you as part of our international community that now spans over 100 countries. It's great to know that there are so many people around the world who are listening to this show and benefiting from the experience, insights, and wisdom of the many truly outstanding people who are guests on the show. I learn so much from each person and gain such valuable perspectives on business, technology, and leadership. I hope you do too. Today I'm speaking with John Cooley, Chief of Products at Nanoramic Laboratories, a company he co-founded. He has over 10 years of experience in leading fast-paced product development in electronic systems, power systems, and energy storage devices. In addition to agile product development, Dr. Cooley is experienced in IP capture, go-to-market strategy, technology licensing and transfer, manufacturing, and program management. Dr. Cooley holds 5 technical degrees from MIT, including a PhD in electrical engineering. In this podcast, he talks about the biggest challenges facing the EV industry, what is neocarbonics at the core, and what sets it apart from other lithium-ion battery technology, and what could be the next big thing in green energy. Before we get started, if you are a supply chain executive who'd finally like to put an end to information overload and get a simple, concise, fact-based summary of key market developments and shifts, then the current situation in sourcing is exactly what you're looking for. To learn more, head on over to thecurrentsituation.net. That's thecurrentsituation.net, where you can find all of the details. Now let's sit down with Dr. Cooley and get an insider's view on what the next big developments in EV technology could be. John, I'm really happy to have you on a seat at the table because I've been quite interested in renewable energy, and I think a lot of people in our audience are as well. Certainly EVs have really taken off, but there's a lot also around solar, around wind. So there's a lot of developments that people are waiting for them to come to fruition. It's interesting to see that we're finally starting to see a breakthrough. So maybe you could start by first telling us about Nanoramic. I mean, what does it do? What are your core products?
Great, thanks. And we can talk a lot about all those topics about renewables and different sources, but okay. Nanoramic is a company that I founded in 2009 with another grad student out of MIT. So we were in the basement of MIT writing a proposal for a DOE grant that we won. And pretty soon thereafter, we got up and running with Nanoramic. At the time, it was called FastCap Systems. And the intent was to develop energy storage technology for those kinds of clean tech applications that you described. Early on, we also recognized that we needed an alpha market or an entry market. So kind of ironically, we started in another, really the opposite industry, which is oil and gas drilling. So we sort of went from the basement of MIT to sort of one-way flights to Houston, Texas and Colorado. And I was personally on oil rig floors deploying our energy storage technology and systems in oil and gas drilling applications. We had success there, and then sort of in the 2017 timeframe, the electric vehicle renaissance started to begin, and we had developed quite a lot of technology over those years. So we sort of finally found our opportunity to enter a real clean tech market, and that has become our lithium-ion battery technology. Around the same time, we rebranded as Nanoramic, so that's where the company name that you know today comes from. But the technology that we developed for lithium-ion batteries is very cool in almost too many ways to describe quickly. It essentially, what it does is it eliminates the most limiting material from the battery, both for performance and cost. And that by doing that, it relaxes all of the design constraints on the battery and the system. And what's elegant about it is that we don't require new or exotic manufacturing equipment. So what this means is that we have all kinds of benefits. We have all kinds of benefits in cost and performance. Really, the benefits and performance metrics that everybody cares about. These are things like, for instance, cost, but also range. So electric vehicle range, how far is it going to go before you have to recharge? and eco-friendliness. So we reduce the carbon dioxide emissions directly from the manufacturing plant for the batteries themselves significantly. That's by 25%.
Wow, that's huge.
Just to give you a sense, 25% reduction in CO2 emissions from a lithium-ion battery plant is roughly 500,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions reductions per year per factory.
Oh my gosh,
so
wow.
That's significant.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this, by the way, is sort of it's a little bit of a plot hole in the transition to EVs that comes up in the media, which is that, we're building all these batteries to make electric vehicles to get CO2 emissions reductions down globally. But by the way, there are CO2 emissions coming from the manufacture of the batteries themselves, which is a pretty energy intensive process.
Right.
So those are a few of the reasons why it's very cool. I think that kind of distinct from a number of other battery technologies that you see in the US and other innovative startups, we're not sort of just developing and scaling up a new and exotic material. And we're not, on the other side of things, we're not sort of developing a completely and radical new way to structure a battery. Instead, we're sort of updating the existing manufacturing processes just to do a better job of using modern materials and expanding the cost and performance envelope of lithium-ion batteries. So just a final point there, I think that, because of all those things, the performance benefits, the cost benefits, but also the fact that we can reuse existing manufacturing infrastructure bodes really well for Nanoramic's technology to be rapidly commercialized. And what we really care about is getting the technology into drivetrains on the road as quickly as possible so that we can have an impact on CO2 emissions.
Yeah, I think that is really significant that you can use existing technology, that you don't have to completely retool, because a lot of the arguments against sort of the scaling, you might say, on EVs is the battery, right? And the fact that you need to create all these charging stations and you don't have enough charging stations with enough frequency in order for people to go the distance, the battery to, so you have to change gas stations into charging stations and so on. So, anytime you can reuse what you already have, is really fantastic.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. And really on the other side of that, like you mentioned with charging stations, we're starting to see some crystallization, I think, about how charging infrastructure is going to work.
Right.
But for the last couple of years, it's been unclear. There's been some talk about needing a lot of fast chargers. There's been talk about, does the paradigm completely shift over to at-home charging only?
Right.
And we are starting to see that sort of crystallize. And it really depends on what your use case is, right? It's hard to have an at-home charger if you live in an apartment in the middle of the city.
Right.
But then again, if you have the ability to charge at home every night, it doesn't make a lot of sense to make a trip to the quote unquote gas station once a week. You just don't have to do that. So there are different use cases, and I think there'll be different vehicles kind of designed for those use cases. And then that really comes back to the battery technology. So you're seeing innovation that will expand and sort of almost bifurcate the battery technology for the two different kinds of ways that people intend to use the cars.
Right. Now, I think that, one of the challenges that's been brought up to me and other discussions of green energy, particularly with regard to batteries, is the ability, the capacity. So in other words, can it hold enough? Can it store enough for either long distance trips, or if it's the case of solar, to be able to carry through when you have a long period with no sun? How do you see that going? How do you see the development of capacity? We're going to take a quick break now, and then we'll be right back.
We were hiring when we were making 50 to 100K monthly losses.
And why? Welcome to episode 1.
I can't think of a single founder who's been around for a decent amount of time in business who hasn't had their tunnel of year. This was that year. We're going to be okay, yeah, Sheree. Some are going to hear this and think, you TDP. But hear me out. You only have to do the math to understand that very soon we were $500,000 down.
Yeah, and I think more and more, I mean, in 2010 and 2008, this picture was a lot less clear. I
Right.
think today it's more clear. There are technologies that are commercial. The both of these markets actually exist in a real way. Wind and solar penetration on the U.S. grid is accelerating, and it's
Right.
significant. Somewhere around 20% is renewables today, and it's increasing every year. And in fact, it's now cheaper to build a solar plus energy storage farm in many cases than it is to build a new natural gas plant. So that bodes really well for
Wow.
renewable penetration on our grid. But on the EV side, there is starting to be a little bit more nuanced conversation about range and battery capacity. It used to be that there was this sort of problem of range anxiety, and there still is. And range anxiety was tied to, well, it's partly it's new technology, so we don't understand it. There's not enough charging infrastructure. So if I buy an electric vehicle, I'm not sure that I'll know I can recharge it in a convenient way. At the very least, I have to have somebody come install a charging station at my house.
Right.
And I think more recently there's been a lot more talk about, well, we've achieved electric vehicles with over 300 miles of range. Really, what we should be focusing on now are things like cost, things like total life cycle,
right,
safety, supply chain resilience.
Right.
Some especially the high range battery technologies require raw materials from all over the world, including Russia, and underdeveloped regions. And, I think that, and really, namely not in the U.S., right?
Yeah.
So I think there's more focus on some of these other aspects. And even in particular in China, there's been widespread adoption of lower range electric vehicle battery technology. There's a particular chemistry there that they focus on called LFP.
Right.
And so I think a lot of it comes down to getting comfortable with the paradigm or the use case for recharging, getting that infrastructure in place. And there's been quite a lot of movement from our federal government to fund that kind of infrastructure and deployment in the U.S. And kind of just having that become clear about how electric vehicle users are going to recharge their vehicles. It may not make sense if you're just commuting to and from the office to pay for a 300-mile range, especially if you're recharging it every night. On the other hand, if you're really using it to go long distances on a regular basis, then you need to know that there are waypoints along the way where you can kind of conveniently recharge as you would refuel your gas tank. So that's kind of where the conversation stands today for electric vehicle battery capacity. And then other applications, it really comes down to different chemistries because the design trade-offs are very different when you're not moving the battery, when you're just installing it in a fixed location.
Right. Okay. So a battery being installed, when you say in a fixed location, it would be in a home or something like that versus a battery being installed in a vehicle?
Yeah. So for instance, for solar and wind power, we call this stationary storage. So you're installing a battery, especially on the grid, you're installing a very large battery system that doesn't move. It just sits on the ground and stores energy from the renewable source and then provides it back to the grid when it's needed. So you can imagine that, for instance, the weight of that battery doesn't matter nearly as much as it does for an electric vehicle. The volume doesn't matter as much as it does for an electric vehicle. And so we talk about energy density, both how much energy you get in an amount of volume and how much energy you get for a given amount of weight. That's very important for electric vehicles, less important for stationary storage. For stationary storage, what we really focus on is really cost and total life cycle. Now, some of the chemistries that work well for electric vehicles, especially some of those lower range chemistries, work pretty well for grid too, because they're very low cost. their energy density is lower. But that, like I said, that doesn't matter so much for the grid. And then in addition to that, there are sort of new technologies that have started to become mature that could take that to the next level in terms of how much energy you can store on the grid for a given amount of money. And so we're starting to see some of these commercial technologies are very abundant now on the grid, supporting renewable energy. And we're starting to see other technologies come out of companies that used to be startups like us and are now finally kind of getting their systems out into the market. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because you touched on a lot of really critical things. I mean, one of which, of course, is that people want to be less dependent on having to import key raw materials, as we're seeing now with this particular war with Russia and the Ukraine. You don't want to be dependent upon raw materials coming from a place where, you're not able to get them. And at the same time, I mean, a lot of what I'm seeing as the push towards green energy, particularly at a government level, is to try to become more energy independent. So not wanting to depend on another country for oil, basically, and to be able to produce your own and have a little more control of your economy, your destiny, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really been one of the key drivers for really all of the commercial startup enterprises in the last 10 or 20 years. And it's been one of the key drivers for the DOE. And they have a branch of the DOE called ARPA-E, which essentially invented to address problems like that and also CO2 emissions. When we think about energy security and we think about energy independence, it for sure, I think the thought process starts with oil imports, but it's broader than that. We're seeing this with electric vehicles and especially electric vehicle batteries. And there are all kinds of considerations around where you get your raw materials and what are the trade-offs there. But we know that being able to source more of this from our own borders, within our own borders, and develop and build these technologies on our own terms is just going to make the transition easier. It's going to bring costs down ultimately, and it's going to make us less sensitive to these kinds of global conflicts and other things that we just don't have control over. And I think there's also, one of the things that you see that's really, I like to say that with the electric vehicle renaissance, the flywheel has spun.
Right.
Even if we didn't want at this point, even if we thought that, even if we thought that we wanted to sort of stop with electric vehicles, I think it's gotten to a point where it's reached a tipping point with market penetration, and I think a lot of that has come from societal pressure.
Right.
There's just a lot of positive momentum that's taken hold in electric vehicle or automakers that really drives what they're doing. It's a lot easier for them to sell to their shareholders and to their customers that they are moving aggressively toward electric vehicles. And so they're doing that. But those same societal pressures come into play when you think about these things like energy independence and security, right? There's a heated and emotional conversation that goes on about where we're getting our nickel supply, right? With the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Nobody wants to support a supply chain that's benefiting, that conflict. And so these things, they definitely matter. They matter really at all levels, from the product development and technology level up to the political and strategic level. And so when we talk about battery chemistries that eliminate the need for nickel or cobalt that come from overseas, there's just a lot more positive tailwinds that kind of get behind you in terms of funding or customer uptake.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're looking to be able to build these batteries using more readily available raw materials.
Yeah. So another thing, there are many things that are cool about Nanoramic's battery technology. And by the way, I don't know if I've mentioned the brand name for our battery technology is Neocarbonics. And there are a lot of things that are cool about Neocarbonics. One of the other things that I didn't mention that's cool about it is that it is quote unquote chemistry agnostic. And so that means that it's a platform technology and it can be applied to really any battery, lithium ion battery chemistry. There are two electrodes inside of a battery, the cathode and anode, and they're fundamentally different from a chemistry standpoint. And our technology not only applies to any active material on the cathode side, but it also applies to the anode side.
Wow.
And so, yeah, and so there's a lot of focus on a battery chemistry called Z, and the N stands for nickel and the C stands for cobalt. And that's a very high capacity lithium ion battery chemistry in general, at least on the cathode side. And we've demonstrated that really mostly driven by customer interest. It's kind of our wheelhouse and standard cell design at this point. Wow. But we're also able to apply it to a chemistry called LFP. And so there's no N and there's no C in LFP. It's called lithium iron phosphate.
Okay.
And so really what you're looking for is iron, your main raw material there. So iron is much more abundant and we can source it domestically. And so there, in the EV automakers that we work with, there's kind of universal interest in adopting that technology. Yeah.
So the Neocarbonics, the product that you've developed, is this sort of a chemistry that people would license the rights to use, or is it an actual component that someone would buy? I mean, how is it sold to the end user?
Yeah,
or not the user, but the person manufacturing the battery.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I could talk a lot about this. We early on in the company's history, we saw cautionary tales around clean tech and clean tech startups, and there's kind of a standard approach to developing a new technology. Maybe it's a material or a component, and then just immediately scaling that up. And if you don't have sort of everything lined up in terms of customer orders, real market traction, investment, and a very good understanding and plan for that manufacturing scale up, there are just a lot of things that can get in your way. And at the very least, that process takes a long time to scale up and get into the market that way. So, I wouldn't say we invented this idea, but we definitely developed a market approach and business model that's leaner than that. It's more focused on product development and commercialization through manufacturing partnerships. A lot of times we call it a licensing model by default, right? So the idea is that we develop our technology and manufacture it to a certain point. Normally what we call it is the pilot scale.
Right.
And in doing so, we've documented both a product design and also a manufacturing process that can be transferred to a licensee. And some of the key benefits of that business model are it's not capital intensive in the way that it would be if we were just owning all of our high volume manufacturing.
Right.
And secondly, you can more rapidly commercialize the technology because what you do in that model is you leverage existing manufacturing capabilities at your licensees.
Right. Yeah, that is really interesting. That's a really great way to be able to get it out into the market, like you say, without having to have a huge amount of capital.
That's right. And it doesn't mean that we can't scale up to some extent to support the actual design in and qualification, even low volume production. But it gives us this option. And what I like about this, especially for Neocarbonics, is that, on the one hand, Neocarbonics has the potential to be rapidly commercialized because it reuses existing manufacturing infrastructure. And then on the other hand, we have this lean business model that is really designed to rapidly commercialize technology. And so our hope is that we can get this on the road very quickly and have an impact on CO2 emissions reductions that we may not be able to have if we were developing either different technology or taking a different approach from a business model standpoint. I should also point out that this is a business model that we've developed and demonstrated, and we've cycled through this. So we've had success with a number of different products in this way.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I'm looking forward to seeing Neocarbonics as sort of the next Intel. For example, as you know, with all the computers and devices, everything was always marked Intel inside. So
That
for all,
that it, yeah, and the way that we think about it is we sell battery cells to our customers, right? And that's what we
right,
manufacture. But there is a core innovation, which I've talked
yeah,
about, which is the elimination of the limiting material and then the processes and materials that go into that. And absolutely, we did think about like, should we call this neocarbonics inside? Well, when the lawyers got a hold of that, they said you can't do that. But what
oh,
you could do is you could call it. We came up with neocarbonics at the core,
oh, that's
which is
great.
kind of exactly the same intent.
Right,
So these
right.
are battery cells with neocarbonics technology at the core.
Yeah, I like that. So when you're looking at developments around cleaner technology, I mean, where do you see the next focus on developments? I mean, is it more on the actual innovation, or do you see it more on taking innovation and trying to find ways to make it more practical so that it could be scaled?
Yeah,
I
and
don't know if I'm making that clear.
yeah, no, it's kind of all of the above, and it really depends on the industry. So we talk a lot about, and today we're talking a lot about electric vehicles, and to some extent, grid-based renewables. What I would say, like I said, the flywheel on electric vehicles is spun. I think that you're just going to see accelerating demand and production. I think that the transition to electric vehicles is going to happen a lot faster than people think. And so for electric vehicles, I think it's at this point, it's really the focus should and really is on scaling manufacturing of technologies that have already been innovated. That's what we're trying to do, and that's what the federal government is trying to do as well.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say similarly, and it's kind of happened quietly, but the penetration of wind and solar on our grid has happened quietly and almost in the background. It's hard to say that if you're staring at a 300 yard wind turbine driving down the road, but
Right.
it sort of happened behind the scenes, but it's really started to pick up. And what's the reason for that is because it's more cost effective to build those kinds of plants than it is to build other kinds of plants.
Right.
And so I think in that industry, really what we need to do is just kind of hope that the cost drivers continue to take hold and motivate installation of renewable sources on the grid. There are completely other industries that are less talked about that are equal contributors to CO2 emissions. Electric vehicles are definitely going to solve part of the problem. Grid-based renewables are going to solve another major, part of the problem. If you divide this up into pies, you sort of have half of the pie is CO2 emissions related to grid and transportation. So we're solving that. You're moving some emissions from vehicles to the grid, actually, when you transition to electric vehicles, because now they're taking their power from the grid. But with renewable penetration on the grid, you're solving that problem at the same time. But there are other industries that we need to address. Agriculture is a significant emitter of methane. Methane is sort of good and bad in the sense that it's way worse for greenhouse as a greenhouse gas
Right.
and global warming. On the other hand, it comes out of the atmosphere much more quickly than CO2. So as we solve those problems, we'll have a more immediate impact on global warming.
Interesting.
And then cement production also emits a significant amount of CO2 emissions. So
Wow.
those two industries are, I would say, those are industries where there has been technology innovation, but maybe the focus is a little bit early, has come a little bit later.
Right.
And I kind of look at it like a pipeline of, we're manufacturing electric vehicle and grid technology. We need to innovate now. We need to innovate on those other industries in order to address CO2 emissions at large.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you wouldn't really think of agriculture or cement as being contributors. You sort of think of it as cars and fossil fuels and things like that. So it's interesting that you bring that up. How much will electric vehicles save in terms of carbon emissions? I mean, massively, significant, or good?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Where on the scale?
Yeah, and a lot of it depends on the profile of the sources of power on the grid, right? Because you're taking
Right.
your power from the grid. And so when you look at these projections, they really they always have to preface the model on what is the mix of energy sources over the time period that they evaluate. But just kind of like from a rough 30,000 foot overview, you can kind of think of it like transport is sort of a quarter of the problem. If we were to convert all transport over to electric, you would have moved something like a quarter of our global CO2 emissions, at least out of the transport sector. Okay. And so now a lot of that, or all of that, is moved to the grid. That's sort of another quarter, right?
Right.
And when we say these numbers, what we're really talking about are effective CO2 emissions. So methane is not CO2, but there's an effective multiplier for methane. And so when we talk about agriculture, the actual volume of methane that's being emitted is much lower, but it still represents something like another quarter of the problem for when we talk about global warming.
Interesting. Now you brought up something that I thought was important, and that is that you charge your electric vehicle, but you're still charging it off the grid. So how much of an impact is that, unless you can get that source of electricity to also be green energy?
Yeah, and this is, I would say, sort of the second plot hole. So we talked about the plot hole that Neocarbonics addresses, which is reducing CO2 emissions from the battery manufacturing process itself. I would say the second major plot hole is that, right? You're moving the energy production from the car now to the grid. There are some fundamental things that go in our favor when we do that. One is that you can just imagine it's more efficient to produce power for a drivetrain if you're doing it centrally at a power plant rather than in a mobile engine. In fact, it's kind of a miracle if you think about an internal combustion engine that this works at all and that you can fit it into a vehicle platform. I mean, if you look under your car, it's a spaghetti rat's nest of piping and wires and mechanical things that are constantly failing. So you can just imagine that if you move all that to the grid where they're producing this at a steady rate in a controlled facility with, in a very large volume, it's more efficient. Right. But really the thing that's going to help us is the move away from fossil fuel burning power plants. And this is, really the move away from coal is really what's helping us. Natural gas power plants are very abundant, but they're roughly half as bad as coal plants. And again, as we move more and more into solar and wind, that problem is going to get even further, is going to become even further mitigated.
That's so interesting. But it's interesting to see that it is getting traction now, because for so long, we'd heard about it and it was really more of a theory. And now you do actually see a lot of, like you said, it is growing quite quickly, the actual application of it. Yeah, exactly.
When we started, these were all ideas and cool things that you could write about in your grant proposal. And we did. We all dreamed about these things. And now it's really about, we're at 20% penetration or 10% market share for EVs. And how fast is that accelerating? And what year can we project 50% penetration? What year can we project 80%? And it's very exciting to see it happen. It's exciting for it to be real. And it's happening much sooner and faster than a lot of people thought. I also want to point out in the US, if you look at market penetration or market share of EVs globally, in the US, we're sort of a year behind the average. Oh, really? Something like 5% market share last year for EVs in the US compared to roughly 10% globally. Some countries are way ahead of that. Some are way behind that. In the US, something that I'm really excited about is that earlier in April, we saw the first deliveries of the F-150 Lightning. Wow. And I think that, and I think a lot of the industry folks believe that the production and deliveries of electric pickup trucks in the U.S. is going to sort of flip the story. It's going to break up what we consider to be sort of a demographical divide. Right, And you're going to start to see everybody really appreciate the benefits of electric vehicles, the simplicity, the performance, the ancillary benefits like being able to power your home. Right. And it's just going to catch on. So I'm very excited about that. You're seeing really every major automaker offer now an electric pickup truck in the next couple of years. And I just think that it's going to accelerate things even further.
When do you project that we're going to turn the corner on that? In other words, where electric vehicles will outnumber, or I guess they'll be phasing out non-electric vehicles. Do you have an idea on that?
So that's a great question. And there have been many business and market reports written about this answer. And there's a few different answers there. One is when does the market share sales overtake the market share of internal combustion engine sales?
Right.
And then there's a completely different question, which is when are there more EVs on the road than internal combustion engines? And that's obviously going to take longer.
Right.
But again, I think this is all going to happen faster than we think. If you look at market reports from 5 years ago, their projections compared to, like, say, last year have come in 5 or even 10 years in some cases for the point where we reach 50% market share for EV sales.
Wow.
If you look at globally, where I've heard in the past that there's a rule of thumb that once you reach more than 11% market share for sales of any new technology, that you've reached a tipping point. I think everybody expects that number to be achieved this year in 2022.
Really?
Yeah, and in many countries they've far exceeded that number already. So I think that we're already at or near the tipping point for electric vehicle sales. You may not see it on the road in the U.S. It's sort of like you see a Tesla in most places. That's still a novelty.
Right.
But the numbers that we're seeing are that we're at a tipping point. This is going to happen, and it's accelerating. But I do think it's an interesting question about sort of the decommissioning or phase out of internal combustion engines. These vehicles have a limited lifetime.
Right.
I think that as it becomes less convenient to refuel your internal combustion engine, I think that as it becomes less common to have an internal combustion engine, it's going to feel almost yucky, to be burning fuel and driving around when most of your neighbors are not. And electric vehicles, they work better. They need less maintenance. There's no oil changes. There's no radiators or transmissions that you need to go get fixed when they fail. And so I think that even that phasing out and decommissioning is going to happen faster than people are thinking.
Yeah, it's really interesting. It'll lead us to the next sort of environmental challenges. What do we do with all these cars running with combustion engines that have no resale market anymore?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that point about resale value is going to help drive people to start focusing on investing, so to speak, in an electric vehicle. I think there's an interesting question there about just let's say this may just mean that there's going to be more turnover in vehicles than there have been historically.
Right.
And so how do you deal with all of that waste?
Right.
I think I don't know. I think there's an established industry around recovering and recycling vehicle parts.
Right.
There are also now growing industries around waste to energy. So this is essentially taking landfills and burning them and turning them into heat energy instead. You're obviously creating some carbon emissions in doing that, but there are sort of net benefits, some people think, in doing that over either sending it to a landfill or reproducing that material and not recycling it. So I think that's an interesting question, and it will sort of depend on how fast the transition happens. Right.
Yeah, I suppose it's sort of on the one hand, you want the transition to happen quickly. On the other hand, it could lead to this huge pileup of discarded vehicles that we don't have the capacity to recycle or repurpose.
Yeah. This was an idea that has driven a kind of a different approach for electric vehicle companies in the past. This is sort of electric drivetrain retrofit. This works well on a fleet level where you have a fleet owner who's willing to invest in making their money back essentially on the efficiency gains. It'll be interesting to see if there starts to become almost like a cottage industry of electric vehicle retrofit for people who don't want to give up their their car, or maybe there becomes an economic incentive for that.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah. Yeah, so that'll be interesting. And there are a lot of these things that we just don't know how they're going to play out. I mean, I think every quarter this industry looks different.
Right.
It's clearer. Some things become clearer, and then new questions come up like these.
Yeah, it is. You're right. It's changing very fast. It's suddenly picked up momentum. Right now EVs are in the spotlight. What do you think is the next big thing? I mean, maybe that's very hard to project, but what might be next?
Yeah. So, I mean, like I said, I think electric vehicle technology is entering a phase where a lot of the core technology is mature. There's a lot of investment in manufacturing and scale up. There will be developments to expand performance and cost to sort of get at the nooks and crannies of the industry, lower temperature, lower cost performance, lower cost batteries, so that we can really get this to be widely adopted. But I think that, outside of that, I think within clean tech, there are a few different disciplines or industries that I mentioned, grid-based renewables and the energy storage that goes along with that, agriculture innovations, and then heavy industry innovations to help with clean tech and climate problems. But there's also another industry that's pretty interesting that's starting to take hold, which is really about carbon dioxide extraction from the atmosphere. This is almost like it's like a control Z on what we've done to the atmosphere. Can we undo the damage that we've done by just literally pulling the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? And you're starting to see real deployments of technology that's doing that. The amount of CO2 that we've emitted and that's in the atmosphere today and that we would need to pull out to make a difference is massive. Billions of metric tons of CO2. And so if we are going to have an impact on that, you have to deploy these technologies at a very large scale.
Right.
So I think that is an interesting thing to kind of keep track of and look at, and to sort of hope that it gets the support that it needs. Kind of separately from that,
right.
Like the sort of natural version of that is forest management and forest sort of replenishing our forests.
Right.
I think that you look at this problem and there are technology solutions and there are economic solutions and then there are policy solutions, and they all overlap and they have to play with each other. I think that there are some policies that could be put into place that could have a major impact on this, just from how we manage our natural resources.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you bring that in, that you can use nature on the one side and technology on the other side. That's
right. These CO2 extraction devices are essentially like mechanical trees, if you want to think about that. But really what they're doing is sequestering the CO2, which is just a little bit different from how it will work in nature. But yeah, you can think of it that way for sure.
Wow. I'm trying to picture a mechanical tree.
Yeah. You can look them up. They kind of look like these gigantic, almost like gigantic air conditioning units, if you look them up. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I'm definitely going to take a look at that. Well, John, you've shared so many interesting insights, and I've learned a huge amount speaking with you. I think a lot of people would want to connect with you. Where can they find you?
Yeah, so, we're doing a lot of really cool things. We're selling batteries. We are working with electric vehicle makers and battery manufacturers. We're also working with partner companies. You can find all of our information at nanoramic.com.
Okay.
And you can reach out to us directly there, either through the contact email or through the contact form. And we'll be glad to talk to you about how we can work together. We're also always looking for manufacturing partnerships. So if you're excited about our technology, you can look us up and reach out.
Okay. Well, I'm going to put that in the show notes, and it'll also be over on our podcast website, seatpodcast.com. So people will be able to go there. I know if people are listening to this while they're driving, they might not be able to write this down, but all of those details will be there on the show notes and on the podcast platform. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, John. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Jane, for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for tuning in to A Seat at the Table. If you enjoyed this episode or learned something from it, I'd love to hear about it. Your feedback powers this show. If you'd like to support the show, please hit the subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Also, share episodes you found valuable on LinkedIn or other social media and call out your biggest insight or takeaway from the program. And don't forget to tag me, Jane Singer. I love seeing which episodes you liked best. And if you have time, please leave a review on any of the major podcast channels. Also, don't forget to check out our website, seatpodcast.com. That's SEAT podcast.com. You'll find all kinds of bonus content there, including free ebooks, discounts on apps and other products, as well as a preview of upcoming podcast episodes. You can also send a message with any thoughts, feedback, or suggestions there, and yes, I will read them. Thank you for joining me today and supporting the show. I'm Jane Singer, and I'll see you in our next episode of A Seat at the Table.